followed by an unending stream of questions and possibly answers.
Possibly also, and not answer.
Sounds good. Is this fine? Can everybody hear me at this level?
Yeah, it might make sense to go.
I mean, does the mic pick up? Yeah? Okay. Great. Well, thank you for inviting me here to speak. I'm really looking forward to this. I think to get started, what I'd like to do is just start with an interesting passage, actually, that comes from Martin Luther King on his visit to India in 1959. And the passage is it's an excerpt from his sermon to his congregation when he returns to the United States in the spring of 1959. And there are a couple of reasons I want to share this, and I'll speak on that after I read the passage. We landed in Bombay, India, and I never will forget it that night. We got up early in the morning to take a plane for Delhi. And as we rode out to the airport, we looked out on the street and saw people sleeping out on the sidewalks and out in the streets and everywhere we went. Walked through to the train station, you can't hardly get to the train because people are sleeping on the platforms of the train station. No homes to live in. These people sleep on the streets at night. Nowhere to sleep. No homes to live in. And even more than that, these people are humiliated and embarrassed and segregated in their own land. So that passage sticks out to me for a couple of reasons. Number one, because the term homelessness is not used, in part because it's my understanding that term had not actually come about at that time. The idea that people lived on the street was, at least in some part of the world, beyond the imagination. And so, ironically, the term homelessness does emerge from that part of the world about a couple decades later. The research on homelessness started to originate in earnest in the 1970s and 1980s in the United States as a response to visible street homelessness that in some way came about because of defunding of public institutions such as public health care facilities, mental institutions, and even defunding of public housing. And so this refrain of no homes to live in is a kind of shock and awe of not having a lexicon, not having any terminology to identify that condition. And so, secondly, much obviously has happened in the last 60 years, and homelessness has been identified as a social problem throughout the world, and no less in India. In fact, India, I would have to say, has a very robust, at least civil society response that has led to public policies in the form of shelters. But despite that, in the last 20 years, we still know relatively very little about how people enter this condition in which Dr. King so many years ago kind of equated with humiliation and a certain type of segregation. So the task of my talk today will be to connect what we know of homelessness in India within the broader paradigm of what we know about urban poverty in India. So essentially locating the homeless among the rest of the urban poor in India based on what the research says. And secondly, based in that context, to understand how certain poor people become homeless, meaning certain people who there are certain people who become vulnerable or at risk not only to urban poverty, but a certain type of urban poverty, which is living on the streets or more recently in shelters. And I'm speaking specifically of Delhi, where since 2010 the city has shelters through Supreme Court orders. So with that in mind, who are the homeless in India? But particularly my talk will focus on Delhi. So as I said, locating the homeless among certain parameters of poverty in the cities. And what research has thus far shown, at least in the last 20 years, is yes, people on the streets, and of course, yes, people in the shelters, belong to a larger group of laborers. Laborers in the city who work in various types of jobs that you may see on your day-to-day and life in the city. Construction, working in dhabas. If you go to a wedding, somebody who is serving at the wedding is likely living on the streets. And this has been confirmed time and again, but I'm using essentially here just citing this kind of salient pieces of research that kind of bring this to light in a very visible way. So yes, they are informal workers, and there are particular spaces in the city, geographies of the city, where this is very visible. Old Delhi has multiple labor addas, labor mandis, what have you, where, yes, people go for their day-to-day sustenance to look for jobs, and they get them through intermediaries. So this has been an emerging and acknowledged reality in the last decade plus. Secondly, they are largely part of short-term migrants, or as Jan Bremen called, footloose migrants. I'm citing his work here because his is longitudinal. He studied particular areas in the country, particular cities in the country where the origins were from Ahmedabad, in Gujarat, over 4 decades. And so what he sort of theorizes based on, yes, empirical evidence is that the large share of migrants that are moving from city to city belong to a kind of labor pool. Short-term migrants live in various contexts of poverty in the cities. So I find this relevant because, yes, you do find that the laborers at the addas, and I'm talking now specifically of homeless laborers, live in various types of urban poor geographies while all the same not having housing. And that's important to note because homelessness does not necessarily mean on the street or just in a shelter. There are various forms of unshelteredness which comes through makeshift shelters. And so I'm just going to use some of his terminology here because he actually does not work on homelessness per se. He doesn't use the term homelessness in his ethnographies, but I see a coherence between what he's saying and the people that we have met in Delhi. And when I say we, I mean the team is me and two other researchers, Sunil Kumar and Bal Govind, who are not here at the moment, and we are working in tandem also with Koshish Tis on this larger project. So construction workers who arrange a bivouac at the building site, brick makers who erect a makeshift hut out of broken and rejected bricks, gangs of paddy harvesters allowed to cook their meal and pass the night in the farmer's courtyard, and the army of cane cutters who camp along the roadside or in the open field in a tent of canvas sheet. So I bring this out because various types of informal labor, various types of housing or makeshift housing. And so in Delhi, we're in our field sites, this is the equivalent to along the roadside, which is in this context, it's under a flyover because this community was along the roadside, but now it's under a flyover after the flyover was built. Similarly, the open field in a tent, this particular gentleman lives in a canvas tent amongst other street or open or people who live out in the open, but of course they're all in the same sort of labor circuit because they use the same labor mandi, and it's the labor mandi that I showed before, which is located in Old Delhi. But again, I want to bring just raise the attention that various types of residences, various types of jobs, but all within this matrix of casual labor, all within this matrix of lack of housing, public housing or otherwise. So now I'm going to just move into some of the cases. We worked, this is based on 60 cases of male migrant laborers in the city, unsheltered laborers in the city. The reason that they're male is because the research has shown that majority of the homeless people in Delhi are single male migrants. Particularly a UNDP study showed about 87% of the 56,000 they surveyed were this category. That's not to say that there are not other diverse groups of families. There are, and we also cover that in another section of the research, but this section I'm only talking about this demographic. So using or relating back to some of these themes that Bremen has brought out, that DuPont has brought out, that the UNDP has brought out, right? Essentially that there is a economic, that homelessness is in some ways economically determined, right? It's a very fair assessment, that you have poor rural people who are coming to the city for various, and working in various types of jobs, mainly because they are leaving the villages or that they are in some kind of labor route. So with that in mind, I want to bring out one of our cases. 50 years old from Jharkhand. My father was an agricultural worker who died of a heart attack when I was 8 years old. There was no one to support us in the village. Forget about money, we couldn't even ask anyone for water, and it was routine for boys to leave the village to find work. I started working on the fields, planting and harvesting onions for farmers when I was 8 years old. We were paid in grain, 2 to 3 kilos per each 2.5 quintal yield, 3 to 4 kilos for higher yields, but only chai and water for yields below 1. No wages. Our house only had grain when we grew it on the fields. Some large farmers paid 100 rupees, but I was very small then, so never earned that much. If you worked for some big shot, you may get 10 rupees, enough in those days to roam the market to buy food and drinks and still have a bit left over. We'd work additional daily wage jobs, in dhabas for instance, to pay for other essentials like cooking oil. Some friends convinced me I'd be able to earn more outside the village, but I left because there was nothing for me at home and came to Delhi with a friend when I was 25 years old. So what I want to highlight here is very strongly economically determined path of migration. However, there's also something that I'll be bringing out later in this talk, which is that early life experience of having lost a earning member of the family, questionably also due to poverty. Now, I'm not going to read the full one here of the next case, just the beginning, but again, also to highlight this theme that will emerge of early life adversities. D from West Bengal. My parents died many years ago when I was very young. My brother is married now. He lives in the village and works whatever job he can find, but wages are very low. Now, I'll just skip and I'll end at this part here. We went hungry, working for no pay. There was no one to look after us at home. So, yes, similar themes in the other case and what some of the research has said, that inability to make farming viable, agricultural laborers coming to the city to find work, but also this other theme of certain social distresses, paramount or primarily deaths of working members, earning members, that may also tell us something that surveys don't catch, or maybe other ethnographies don't catch also. So the question I want to ask at this point is, how do we move from identification to causation? How do we move from identifying, yes, that homeless, particularly male migrants, are laborers, that they are, yes, they are migrants, yes, they are coming to the city in some ways to earn or maybe to escape, but how do we delve deeper into this aspect of what actually is the nature of the poverty that would create homelessness and not some other kind of urban poverty, right? So based on a lot of the current research, what has happened is that taking the fact that homeless, particularly male migrants, are laborers, has led to the conclusion in some ways that it's fully economically determined. And further, that the causes and conditions of homelessness in India differ from Western countries, and particularly the United States, because in the United States, most homeless people are unemployed. So what the life history method attempts to do is kind of thicken some of these like causalities. Yes, there may be an economic motive. Yes, there may be some structural inequalities, particularly landless laborers who don't have access to resources. And there is multi-generational or intergenerational poverty. There's a collapse. But what the life history method can do is actually give us some understanding of the perceptions that people have who endure those circumstances. It can also give us a thicker description of the cause that may not, may take certain economic distresses and social distresses as things that are not necessarily mutually exclusive but have to be looked at in tandem. So in that context, what our team has tried to do is to use this method, which is essentially asking about somebody's life in 3 stages: before leaving home, while in the city, and case-by-case basis on other cities that you travel to. What was the relationship with your family, with your parents? What stresses did you endure? What did you think when you had to leave home? Why did you leave home? Do you remember the first thought that came to your mind when you landed in Delhi? These kinds of questions to kind of jog not just the imagination, but the memory. And the idea is to give us some understanding into these kinds of questions, the nature, not just the cause, but the nature of family tensions, early deaths of caregivers, and conditions of work. And therefore, then how does the nature then lead to migration? What does family conflict actually mean? What does poverty actually mean from the vantage point of people who have had to endure these specific circumstances? I mentioned the economic and social determinants. Where do they, cohere? Where are they mutually exclusive? But how do other risks alongside economic poverty also induce migration, such as abuse? And how do men experience, perceive, and respond to these risks? Based on some of these questions, I hope to be able to yield that answer of moving from identification of experiences to a kind of tapestry, which will be the typologies of an understanding of the pathways. So what I'm going to do before I get to the typologies, which are sort of the results section, is explain how I'm merging a couple threads of research, a couple frameworks to get to this kind of storyline or multiple storylines that lead to typologies. So the first one is adverse life experiences. Now, a lot of this research originates in the United States, but first I'll talk about what has been carried over into India because it, links up directly to the cases that I'll talk about. So there are sort of 2 ideas here on the effect of adverse experiences, such as death, such as abuse, on the eventuality of homelessness. So one, Steinberg's study on homeless children, he kind of concludes that these adverse experiences lead these young children to seek freedom, that they don't want to return to their families, and the next phase of life is seeking independence, right? And the second one, which was Gopi Kumar and her team's study of homeless adults in China. Chennai. China. Yeah, sorry, yeah, Chennai. Actually relates the findings or of the experiences of their cases with the findings of certain studies in Western countries. What's interesting here is that she finds that they find violence, loss of primary caregiver at an early age as a common experience, which I find also very relevant because that's something that I'll talk about as well. So those outcomes also included the onset of mental illness. So in this sense, kind of framing mental illness as an outcome of some of these early life experiences that lead to being thrown out into homelessness. In the U.S., there's several studies that have been done in various methodologies over the last 12 or 13 years. And I want to just focus on Paget's because her methodology is also life history based, and she hones in through the voices of her respondents on these adverse experiences. And I found that many of them mirror the voices of the people that we spend time with. So as you can see that, a lot of her respondents, 1/3 of her respondents lost mothers, 1/5 lost fathers, siblings. So these deaths are they are catalysts to further deprivations in life and arguably to homelessness itself because they often induce other outcomes such as poor health, even homicide, alcoholism. So I want to just kind of pluck that out of a range of studies because it has relevance to the batch of cases that we spent time with, and the outcomes are also similar. So that means they're similar in different country contexts, in India and in the West, which have different structural context of homelessness, mainly the fact that, yes, most homeless people in India work, which is not the case in the West. But the kind of germination may be similar. The very root causes of both trajectories may have something to do with each other. So regardless of the conclusions based on those adverse experiences, what's essential to note is that all of these complexities are missed by our current standards of measurement of homelessness. There actually is no there is no definition of homelessness officially. By proxy, it's determined by houselessness, which is defined by actually households. So that's another kind of step in the other direction, who live in a structure without a roof, right? So overall houselessness has declined from 2001 to 2011, but increased in the cities, and there are many contested figures in Delhi itself. But I caution against these figures because, again, the metrics are on the very face of it inaccurate. Households is not necessarily in cities like Delhi the metric that you should use, and housing is a centrality, housing quality is centrality for homelessness is also fraught with problems. So alongside adverse experiences, which are very specific traumas that what happened in people's lives who may predominantly be poor or of a particular social class that could be defined as poor, is also the idea of risk, that there are particular vulnerabilities that people in such conditions may face to, one, further poverty, certain types of poverty in the future, and relevant to this discussion, actual homelessness, right? And so these matrices of risks have been discussed now for about 2 decades, originating, all types of contexts in the global south, but essentially in response to income-based measures of urban poverty, because consumption and income-based metrics are often much lower in global south countries than other, obvious metrics like the number of people that live in informal settlements, the number of people that die of poverty-related illnesses such as tuberculosis, right? So based on these range of risks, particularly in growing cities like the cities in India, it's been tossed around, it's been theorized that there should be an assessment of, there should be indicators of risks that people would face who live in a particular context, particular kind of poverty, that would push them further into a form of deprivation that static measures can't measure. It's like static measures of like income cannot measure. So years ago, this was actually proposed by a government assembled committee, and they proposed that there should be a matrix of residential, occupational, and social risks to kind of identify who in the city is poor. And the reason I'm adding this here is because homeless people or people on the streets, people that were not in even in a census house or a standard housing structure of standard quality would have been included. Now, this did not get off the ground in large parts because states could not come up with criteria, but it was at least discussed. So, based on these two metrics of adverse experiences and vulnerabilities. So just one more thing about vulnerabilities. I mentioned the, working in the informal economy. So I take that as a vulnerability in the city. But I also extend that to the origins of, that certain people who had to labor in the informal economy from a very young age may have faced certain risks that when an adverse experience like the death of a family member occurred, flung them not only to further poverty, but homelessness. So based on these two measurements or these two frameworks, the kind of indicators for assessing a life history, applying vulnerability to homelessness is follows. Relationships are key. In absence of assets, land, adequate housing, access to food, the way that we can understand how certain people who are so deprived would actually exist would be the bonds that they have, particularly landless laboring families who have certain types of multi-generational poverty. So that idea of relationships covers home and while they're in the city. Then networks outside of the relationships that they have with family members, networks that they've relied on to survive, to get jobs, to get help when there's no money in the house, right? And using that to distinguish between what are the risks in terms of not having those things or having those things at the exchange of having to do something which further incapacitates you, or capacities, which is like social capital. In this context, it's social capital, which is when in the context of being poor or not having resources or not having enough resources that would officially put you over the poverty line, social capital comes in the form of people that you can rely on. So lastly, using these or reading these life histories in a way that you can distinguish between economic and social factors that lead to further impoverishment in both the village and in the city, respectively. And just merging the adverse experiences in this framework, what we're trying to do is kind of trace out those traumatic experiences in early life that either led to conflict, that either led to further poverty, a combination at home, Of course, that is not captured in surveys, but is crucial, especially from their perspective, to understand why and how rural poor people become homeless in the city. Now, what's important here is that there are two types of homelessness. There's transient homelessness, in which somebody is itinerant, they move between the city and their home, and there is chronic homelessness, which is being unhoused, being unsheltered in the city indefinitely. And I'll just mention that as a subset to chronic homelessness, there is like a mobile homelessness, which is that some people who are indefinitely homeless move from city to city, but not necessarily back home. So most of the people that we spoke to are from UP. So the major states are UP and Bihar, and then you have a large scattering of many other states, West Bengal, Assam, but most of them come from the rural areas of UP and Bihar, also the rural areas of these other states, but there's a high concentration of UP and Bihar. So what I want to do is just go over this matrix, right, which is the kind of where across adverse experiences and reasons, which can be viewed as the vulnerability break, that people fall on this matrix. Now, I want to reiterate that the life history approach is qualitative and it's not quantitative. And so most of the work and the way it's displayed is qualitative in nature. But the framing, of course, is as follows. So there are four main points that I want to just draw out of this here. And maybe I should just say before that, so that we're all on the same page. So we have the reason for leaving home, and like I said, which is like the break. The transient and the chronic is the outcome, and the adverse experience is the early life, right? So just so that, for clarity. So the first thing is that most people are chronically homeless. About 2/3 of the people are chronically homeless. But on the face of it, that doesn't really tell you much. You have to we kind of have to look deeper into what were the experiences of particular people that would maybe indicate why somebody was chronically homeless versus why somebody is transiently homeless. And so the second point I want to share brings this out, okay? So what we see is that both deaths of parents and the need to support families, which are these major adverse experiences, are kind of dispersed throughout chronic and transient homeless men, but they're concentrated in chronically homeless men who left both due to conflict and the search for work, respectively. Within this point, the need to support family at a young age is concentrated in the search for work transient group, right? So in a way, the deaths of parents amongst particularly poor people is in some ways an indicator of a future in this population.
I'm not very clear about are these two reasons completely different, mutually exclusive from each other? Or
Which reasons?
support family at an early age and parents die.
Yes, they are. Sorry. So the support family at an early age means that the parents are still alive, right? So that's why I've just.
That is unmoored from parental ties influence.
I'm sorry?
Unlocked from parental ties, the other group. Like in the sense that the parent is dead and they die.
Yeah, meaning the parent dies one? Yes, right. So that's why I'm distinguishing between those, exactly. That the parent dies, and then the need to work is essentially the need to live. So I should make that clear. Whereas supporting family at an early age is at the behest of the family needs to survive, so you have to work when you're 6, 7, 8 years old, right? Yeah. So the last 2 points here before I move on to the actual, typologies, is that, you see, in some of those other studies that I shared that concluded that, homelessness was a cause of economic distress, many of them were relying on like this survey method that was showing that many people were saying, I came because I needed to work, even when it was slightly, it wasn't like 90% to 10%. It may have been like 60-40, but there were these conclusions that were drawn, right? That it's an economic imperative, which I'm not disagreeing with. I'm just saying that there needs to be an add-on. And so in this group where, the search for work, it's kind of split, right? That, you end up being transient or you end up being chronic. What I just want to highlight here is that, it's not just about economic strain leading to homelessness. It's about a certain kind of economic strain leading to a particular type of homelessness, right? Where leaving to find work can also can transform a transient homelessness condition to a chronically homeless condition. And in many of the studies that I read, this distinction between chronic and transient wasn't really made clear, and I think it has to be made clear because these are point-in-time counts. So assessing who is homeless when is important because you don't know what the duration in the city is. If somebody is spending 6 months in the city and 6 months at home, they obviously would not be counted in the off-season periods. It's not easy to get that information, but I think it's just something that we have to be aware of. And lastly, conflict of any kind of precipitates a kind of chronic homelessness. So I'm going to discuss what I think are the two main vulnerabilities to homelessness amongst this population of poor, rural, largely agricultural, laboring people, which is that nearly half of them that we spoke to experience these traumas of this, the death of a parent. A little bit more than half lost their both parents, and then 11 lost fathers. And so what I want to draw out here is just what the impact is at that point in life. Usually, and I'm just kind of grafting from many of the stories, but the trend is that once this happens, the kids work as agricultural laborers or other, daily wage jobs, often multiple jobs at once, for various durations of time. It's not that once the father dies or both parents dies, then the next week you become homeless. But this is actually why I think it's even more important to understand what effect that would have on the long term, because many of these men were kids when they came, but they didn't come as soon as their parent died. They hung on for like 4, 5, 6 years maybe, and then had no choice, were compelled to leave for the city. The second one is this need to support the parents. And again, this is in a context of poverty. It's maybe in a context of destitution, which don't have time to discuss here, but the need to support parents is out of distress. And so, 17 discussed this as a catalyst for homelessness itself. But I'm going to refer you here to this case because what's important is the perception of this, in some sense, this duty to support family, or this duty to survive after having had the obligation to support family. What I mean here is that In some cases, it's not perceived as a negative situation. And that's me from the outside looking in. And that's a qualitative kind of, statement. But I think it needs to be said because there is an aspect of a mode of survival that needs to be understood from their perspective. So I'll just share this one here. Jay from Nepal says, I come from a family of farmers and day laborers. No one is educated. They got by. We received payment in grains, which we'd sell to support our families. 5 kilos would fetch about 25 rupees. When the season ended, you'd have to go elsewhere for work, laying brick, for instance, which was available nearby. You didn't find work during summers. My father was the main income earner. We were poor because we didn't have much land. My Dadaji had 6 kattas, which was divided equally among his sons after he died, but 2 was not enough to survive on. Dadiji survived Dadaji and lived with us. Each of the brothers worked the land together. They pooled their earnings to support all members of the family. Now, he says here, I apprenticed as a tailor, meaning he took also other jobs. So this is what I want to end with, which is important, which is his perception. He says, we were poor, but we also got along. We never fought. We did face hunger, but we didn't sleep hungry. We were happy then, no tension. And this is actually somebody who went from transient to chronic. And one of the reasons that that happened was because he couldn't make it anymore. And so he couldn't save face. And so these are some of the issues that happen, that the strain that is on you, that you can't make that journey anymore. You can't fulfill your obligation, so you kind of drift off into the city. The reason Steinberg's work is relevant here, the study on children, is because this is a story in some ways of entering the situation very young. 21 cases left home much before they were 18, before they were 14 years old. And a lot of that has to do with those specific traumas of the deaths of the parents or the pressure to earn in a particular situation when there's no way out, right? So the collapse, yes, it does happen based on certain structural features that the earlier, researchers have shown, that landless laborers, of course, are much more powerless and have much less access to resources to stay rooted to the land and to the village. But all I'm saying is that within the home, those pressures exert, or those circumstances exert certain pressures which leave no choice in some cases but to flee. And the way that I've kind of I've tried to organize these indicators based on these typologies. And again, those indicators are the actual adverse life experiences, the vulnerability to further poverty based on relationships, based on networks, and thirdly, the outcome of becoming chronically homeless and or transiently homeless. So based on that, and I'm exceeding 45 minutes here, so I'll just wrap up. I'll just talk about this very quickly. What I've done here, I'll just describe the typology and then based on that, how they're ranked. So the abandoned is the most vulnerable in my estimation. Deaths of parents in these cases occur at an early age. The remaining family members do not actively raise these orphan children. Additional traumas such as abuse are common. Perception of homelessness teeters between freedom and solitude. So the case that I shared earlier was abandoned. He said no one was there to look out for us, right? Because his parents died. The expelled is next. Deaths of parents occur at an early age. The conflicts between the remaining members ensue, such as over land and or other resources. These men are chronically homeless. Runaways, children who experienced abuse, abscond. They are chronically homeless. Now we're moving into the category where you see both chronic and transiently homeless men. The replacements. Deaths of parents require children to work. Difference between them and abandoned and expelled in this regard is that the primary function of replacement is to bring in income lost by the deceased parent. So I think that kind of speaks to some of that, what you were saying earlier. Then the supplementers. Poverty compels these children to supplement parents' earnings, such as on the farm, but work is often unpaid. Adverse experiences vary in this group, including abuse and health burdens of family members. Financial strain can, in these cases, lead to family conflicts before and or after the eventually homeless person leaves home. You find both chronically and transiently homeless people. And now, again, in my estimation, the least vulnerable, and when I say vulnerable, it doesn't mean poor. It just means at risk to a long duration of homelessness. The family men. Pressures from poverty induce children to work to support family, but relationships remain strong, and leaving home to find work in the city is viewed as a duty to their families. The perception is critical here, for the mantle of duty is assumed independent of family tension. Transient homeless. And lastly, despite the wanderers, despite poverty, no reported adverse experiences, but left home to see the outside world. When I say no reported adverse experiences, I mean the things that happen that I would consider adverse experiences, such as a difficult form of poverty, seeing one's father actually go to the city to earn, to be homeless, to earn for the family, and sometimes even I think taking him along was not viewed as an adverse. I couldn't tell if that was if he was forced to do that or not. But was essential is that they didn't view their lives. They didn't view any adverse experiences in their lives. So I have to take that into consideration, because also they are in touch with their families and mainly transiently homeless. So it just looks like this on the scale of vulnerability, that from the least to the most. Basically, just a synopsis of what I've just said. And that I will end there because I've gone over my time. So thanks. I'll be sure to note down suggestions, feedbacks, and feedback, questions, and suggestions. Thanks. So, thank you.